And we were lucky enough to get the town hall tonight to be able to talk about a very important issue coming up facing all Vermonters. And right at the time when we're looking at affordability issues. So we thought it was really important to have somebody here that knew more than we did. So Dave Sulia organized this from Pittsburgh for us, and I worked with him to get the space, and so here we are. And I am so excited to talk about this topic and learn the specifics of what's happening in our State House about our heat, because it's critical for all of us. So I want to welcome Rob Roper, the Rob Roper, okay? He's my hero. He writes regularly about Vermont political and financial issues, and he has an incredible ability to be able to read these bills, these legal bills, and understand them and do the math to compute what they're going to cost. And he has, he's written, I think he's a freelance writer for 20 years on Vermont politics. He served as chair of the Vermont Republican Party from January 2007 to November 2009, and 9 years as president of the Ethan Allen Institute, Vermont's free market think tank from 2013 to 2022. In between, Rob hosted a radio show on WDEV and started and edited the online news outlet True North Reports. Rob currently writes a regular column on Substack called Behind the Lines. And if you're on my Republican email list, you've received a few of those. And if you're not on it and you'd be interested to be on it, please see me afterwards. He writes regularly on, it's called Behind the Lines, Rob Roper on Vermont Politics. Rob lives in Stowe with his wife and 2 dogs and his 2 adult children. Like too many Vermont young people have left the state. So I turn this over to the Rob Roper, one of my heroes, for telling us what's really happening up there when we can't understand, to explain to us about this clean heat standard and what's happening with property taxes. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you, Dave, for putting this on. I don't know about the V title, just me. But a little bit about me and my column before I talk about some of these issues. And as Sharon said, I ran the Ethan Allen Institute for 9 years, and when I stepped away, I was wondering what to do with myself. I knew it was time to do something else. And I had, in that position, written a column a month for the Ethan Allen Institute that I'd send around to various, all of the papers in the state, and some would pick them up, and some didn't. But I had started in 2020 with the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Clean Heat Standard, and a lot of the energy policy that we're dealing with today. We're starting to get hot, and I followed it very closely. And I had written 2 columns in a row on the Global Warming Solutions Act and the Clean Heat Standard. And I got a note from one of the editors of the paper who regularly did pick up my stuff, and he said, why do you keep talking about this? You've written the last 2 columns on this Clean Heat Standard thing, and why'd you write about something else? And I responded to him. I said, look, this is supposed to be transformational policy. It's supposed to not only change the way we drive our cars and how we heat our homes, and it's going to cost billions of dollars, and it's going to be extremely complicated. It's going to impact businesses, homes. Don't you think that it deserves more than 750 words once a month? In fact, your news reporting organization should have a full-time reporter covering the hearings that they're having in the committees. They should be covering the climate council meetings, and they should be covering what's happening in the legislature on a day-to-day basis. It's all out there. Why aren't you covering this? And I never got a response to that email, which was kind of an eye-opener for me. And I said to myself, it was one of those, if not you, then who moments. And so what I decided to do was, I'm going to start a Substack column, and I am going to pay as close attention to this as humanly possible. I want to understand it, and I want to make other people around the state understand what's happening with these energy policies. So that was the origins of Behind the Lines, which is a double entendre, or maybe even a triple entendre, because I feel like I'm sort of behind the lines in a socialist state, and I also want to get behind the lines that are fed to us by the media and the politicians and really get to the meat of these policies. So it is a beautiful, beautiful day outside, and this room is full, which I'm pleasantly surprised at. I guess the prospect of $8 a gallon home heating fuel is enough to get people to listen to a story about this policy on such a beautiful day. So let's start with the clean heat standard and what is... yes?
I think we're going to kill the mic.
We're going to kill the mic?
Because there's so much static, isn't there?
But the mic's in the back might still be working.
Is that static from the mic, or is that something else?
We don't know. Something's wrong with the speakers.
Some sort of feedback in the speakers.
Okay, well, I can
We hear you better without the mic at this point.
I'm loud, so if you can hear me, I guess the key thing is that the phone can hear me. I don't have to carry that thing around anyway, so all for the better. So the Clean Heat Standard, we got to go back in time to 2020 in the Global Warming Solutions Act. The Global Warming Solutions Act was passed by the legislature over Governor Scott's veto, and basically what it did was, without knowing how it was going to be paid for, how it was going to work, or if it was even feasible, Vermont would have to lower our greenhouse gas emissions by certain mandated targets by 2025, which is about 2 months from now, 2030 and 2050. And ultimately, I think it's by 2050, it has to be 80% below 1990 levels of output of greenhouse gas emissions, which is a really daunting task. It's an incredibly daunting task. And if we don't meet these mandates, says the Global Warming Solutions Act, anybody has standing to sue the state of Vermont, which is us, the taxpayers. And not only do we have to pay to defend a suit from anybody, and I will point out that the Conservation Law Foundation has already announced that they are going to sue the state now, based on a couple of issues that they have with how we're calculating greenhouse gas reduction emissions, and they say that we have not followed the law in terms of public outreach. So they can sue basically for anything. But we're also going to have to pay their fees when we lose, and we're going to lose these suits because the goals set forward in the Global Warming Solutions Act are impossible for us to meet as a state. So they've passed this thing. You've got to do these, but what's not in the Global Warming Solutions Act is any way to actually do it. And we emit greenhouse gas emissions from our cars, we emit it from our businesses, we emit it in our agricultural activities, and one of the places that we emit the most, about I think it's 40-something% of our greenhouse gas emissions comes from heating our homes. They call it in the legislature the thermal sector, but it's basically you keeping warm in winter, heating water throughout the year, and cooking throughout the year if you cook with gas, propane. And they've devised this system called the Clean Heat Standard, which basically is a carbon tax on a ton of greenhouse gas emissions. The way they've structured it is that somebody like Judy Taranovich here in the front row with Procter Gas, if she wants to sell you a gallon of propane, or however much propane it takes to burn, emit a ton of carbon, she has to buy a carbon credit from somebody, somewhere. Probably a default delivery agent who is yet to be determined, but it's going to be Efficiency Vermont. She's going to have to pay them for this credit. The credit functions essentially as an excise tax. We have a 2-cent excise tax on fuel already. It raises about $5 million a year. There is no difference structurally about paying somebody a carbon credit in order to sell your product or paying the state a tax in order to sell your product. It is functionally the same thing. But the Clean Heat Standard is not, where it differs from being a tax, is that it is so convoluted in how it works, because Judy now has to figure out how many tons of carbon is emitted from the product that she sells to you all. Are you using it for cooking? Are you using it for a generator for your electricity, which doesn't count, by the way. She has to figure all this stuff out in order to buy enough credits in order to sell you your product to this default delivery agent. I mean, this is just insane. What gets you credit? They still haven't determined who owns these things, but how do you generate a credit? Well, it's almost like Bitcoin. It's almost like we're almost creating a cryptocurrency with these clean heat credits, because I can get a credit by insulating my house or installing a heat pump or I think there are 11 categories or 12 categories of things that you can do that removes a ton of carbon from the atmosphere, at least theoretically, that when you do that, you can claim a credit. Well, think about that. Think about that for a second. Because they have said that in order to meet the thermal requirements by 2030, we have to install, I think it's 122,000 heat pumps. We have to install a similar amount of heat pump hot water heaters. We have to switch something like 13,000 households to biofuels from regular fuels. Every single one of those actions, just like mining Bitcoin, has to be verified by somebody that it took place. It has to be quantified by somebody that says, okay, you installed a heat pump. How much carbon does that actually take out of the atmosphere over the life of this machine, which could be about 15 years? And that's not every heat pump's not the same, because if you put a heat pump into a big house, it doesn't do as efficient a job as if you put it into a small house. If you put it into one that is well insulated, it does a much more efficient job of reducing carbon than one that is not well insulated. So each one of these things is completely unique, and somebody has to verify that aspect of it. This is going to be hugely bureaucratically complicated and expensive to do. And Dick McCormick, who is a senator from Windsor County who is retiring, he sits on the sits on the Natural Resources and Energy Committee in the Senate. Bless his heart, one day in committee he said, I do not understand how this thing works. To me, it looks like a Rube Goldberg carbon tax. And bless his heart, he was absolutely right. That is what it is. It is a complicated mechanism of implementing a carbon tax on your home heating fuel. How much is this carbon tax going to cost you? The estimates just came out. They did a potential study for a group called NV5, which is paid for by your taxpayer dollars. There's a lot of misinformation out there about misinformation, saying that these numbers are being generated, or implying that these numbers are being generated by an out-of-state political action group. They are not. These are your taxpayer dollars at work through the agency through the Department of Public Service, working with the Public Utilities Commission to do this potential study. And the estimate is that it's going to cost about somewhere between $1.79 to $4 a gallon extra on your home heating oil or kerosene bill. It's going to cost you somewhere between 95 cents and $2.12 on your propane bill. That's how much this is going to cost. Now, all that stuff that I was talking about before with the hiring bureaucrats and figuring out some sort of system of verifying these things, they say it's going to cost $40 million. They're not saying this, but if you look at the numbers, you can break it out. And I did contact the Department of Public Service about how much is the administration of all this going to cost. And the number that they pointed to me to was about $40 million a year. $40 million a year just to run the program. That's 20 cents a gallon on your home heating fuel bill just to run the program. And it's really an insult on injury. Because not to give them any ideas, but if they just raised the 2-cent excise tax on home heating fuel, there would be no added bureaucratic cost to this. They could have implemented 3 years ago if they really cared about saving the planet. They didn't do that. They're charging you $40 million extra every year to create a program so they don't have to call it a tax when they run for re-election this November. That's insult on top of injury, if you ask me. Now that's the complicated part of the clean heat standard of how are you going to verify all this stuff. The other question that comes up is, okay, I've installed the heat pump. I've determined, some bureaucrat has come in and determined that it is going to take so many tons of carbon out of the atmosphere over 15 years, so I've got this credit. I'm a homeowner. What's it worth? And they tell me, okay, it's a number, it's worth, say it's $20. I don't know what it's going to be, $100. I'm making up a number here because they don't know what the number is either. What do I do with it? They have to create a bank for this new cryptocurrency thing that they have created. That is, it's a financial instrument. Now you've got a financial instrument that has to be regulated as such. So you got to put it in a bank, and it has to be secure. This bank, the IT system that is going to be required to run a bank that has to process hundreds of thousands of these clean heat credits, be able to trace who owns them. Most of the people who are going to end up owning them aren't going to need them. They're not obligated parties, so they got to sell them to the obligated party. The obligated party has to then keep them until they retire, and somebody has to keep track of them and then retire them when they retire. This is massively complicated. Massively complicated, massively expensive. And at the end of the day, it is not going to do anything to lower, to change the trajectory of the temperature outside. It's not going to stop any floods from occurring in the future. It's really just an exercise in virtue signaling by the legislature with your tax money for absolutely no apparent benefit. That's what the clean heat standard is. And here's why it's so important for everybody to understand this now. What it's going to cost, what it could potentially... In fact, I think that the potential cost, when they say that this is going to be $4 a gallon, $2.12 for propane, I actually think it's going to be low, because one of the things that it doesn't account for is any sort of social safety net program for low-income Vermonters. There's a logistical problem to this, and the reason we're going to get sued is because there's not enough labor in the state to actually do all of the work. They say, you've got to put in 120,000 heat pumps and you've got to weatherize 95,000 homes by 2030. Well, there just aren't enough people in the construction business, the plumbing business, the electrician business who are certified to do this work in order to do that. They say there are about 700 people who are licensed and capable of doing the work, and we need something like 5,000 or 6,000 in order to do this amount of work on this time frame, and they're not there. So what they say is that we're going to help low-income people. So if you're a low-income person and you're looking at $4 a gallon, I think it's like 750 gallons of fuel oil is what people burn. The average home burns over the course of a year in order to keep their home. So really over the course of probably 6-7 months to keep warm in winter. Well, if it's a $4 a gallon tax, that's like $3,000 a year carbon tax to stay warm and survive the winter in the state. And they're saying, the lip service that they give is that this is going to be a just transition and we're going to take care of low-income people. But in order to be able to take advantage of a transition to an electric heat pump, you've got to be in a building that allows you to do that. And if you live in a mobile home, they can't have heat pumps installed. It just doesn't work. If you live in a lot of the older housing stock that we have in the state, it's a lot of small rooms. It doesn't have an open floor plan. It's probably not very well insulated. It doesn't work. very, very well for you to be able to do that. And the upfront costs of then having to insulate that house and put in a new electric panel and do all that stuff, if you're living in that kind of situation, which a lot of our low-income people are, it's extremely expensive and it's time-consuming. So what I see happening is a lot of low-income folks are going to be stuck paying the high cost of the heating fuel, and the high cost of the heating fuel is going to pay for the subsidies of other people who can afford to very quickly transition over to an electric heat pump, which is what they want you to do. It's a carrot and stick approach. The carrot is that if you do what we tell you to do and get on the electrification bandwagon, we'll give you a free heat pump, we'll weatherize your home for free, and we'll install it. We'll do all that stuff for you for free. Well, where does the free come from? It comes from the people that are stuck paying their oil bill and their propane bill. That's what that $4 goes for. So the program doesn't work unless you have people funding it by continuing to buy the product that they say they want everybody to get off of. So it's somebody described it as, I forget what the term is called, but the snake eating its tail. And that's why it's just not practical. And even though they say, 16% of the Clean Heat Standard measures, the installations, the weatherizations, they have to go to low-income people, and another 16% has to go to either low-income or middle-income households. And the ability to make that work just isn't there logistically. So what's going to happen is you're going to get upper-income people who are able to say, I got the cash, I can do this now, send the workmen over to my place. That they're going to get the job, because the other person says, well, I'm low income, I need a subsidy, I have to apply for the subsidy, that has to get processed, somebody has to come in, we have to line up this, and by the time that happens, it's going to be gone. So you're going to, even if you don't want, even if you say, fine, I will pay, I don't want to pay the $4 a gallon for my heating fuel, I will do the electrification that you're de facto forcing me to do, I'm in. I have a feeling that a lot of people are just going to get, well, that's great, you're on a waiting list. We'll see you in a couple of years. In the meantime, $3,000 extra every year to heat your home. That is the Clean Heat Standard, and that's how I see it working. Just one concluding thought on this is, I said that this is the thermal sector. The thermal sector. Well, I guess two concluding thoughts here. One is, if the politicians scramble, and before this next election, there's going to be a vote. There's one more vote. This thing is not in place yet. Well, it is. Act 18 is law, so we are stuck. The state is temporarily, anyway, I hope we can repeal it, stuck with having a commitment to do a carbon credit system for home heating fuel. That's what the law says. But the rules about how this is going to be implemented are being crafted by the Public Utilities Commission now. And the legislature is going to vote on it in January. The makeup of the legislature is crucial to what happens in January as to whether this thing gets implemented or gets put on mothballs until the act can be repealed. Now, the current legislature, I will point out, some of them are gone, but in 2022, they passed it. The governor vetoed it. They tried to override the governor's veto, and they missed by one vote in 2022. So they came back again in 2023. They passed it. The governor vetoed it. They overrode his veto this time. So if you think that they are going to come back, if you send the same crowd back to Montpelier and think that they are going to all of a sudden say, no, we're not going to do this, you got another thing coming. That's the crucial vote. That's why voters need to understand what this is before November. Actually, before September 23rd, when I think the ballots get mailed out for early voting and mail-in ballots. Now, this is just, my second thought is, concluding thought on this, is that this is just the thermal sector. And as I said, the thermal sector is about 40-something% of the greenhouse gas emissions to meet the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act, which has to be 100%. The other big chunk is transportation. And they haven't talked a whole lot about this yet, but you are going to have to see before 2030 something similar for gasoline and diesel. And they were looking in the part of the Global Warming Solutions Act Climate Action Plan at something called the Transportation Climate Initiative. And that was basically the same thing as the Clean Heat Standard, but for gasoline and diesel. It was a regional approach with, I think, 11 or 12 states in Washington, D.C. were originally looking at this, and all of the states except Massachusetts said, no way, we ain't doing this. This is nuts. Because it was, you know, it was a gas tax. It was a gas tax on how people get to and from work. And we calculated it as about 30 cents per gallon for gasoline if they did it through the Transportation Climate Initiative. But the original carbon tax on gasoline and diesel that VPERC proposed back in 2013 was closer to $1 a gallon. And if they want to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act, you're talking about $1 a gallon for gasoline. So $4 a gallon for your home heating fuel, $1 a gallon for your gasoline in order to meet the mandates of the Global Warming Solutions Act. If we don't do it, we get sued. So that is my spiel on the climate action, the Clean Heat Standard and the Climate Action Plan. I know Dave, when he invited me to come, also wanted to talk about property taxes. So I can either talk about that now, or we can do questions on Clean Heat Standard and then transition. Does anybody have a thought?
I had a question about the Clean Heat Standard. You mentioned Act 18.
Yeah.
That's the Affordable Heat Act, correct?
I don't call it the Affordable Heat Act because it ain't.
Yeah.
But yes, technically you're correct.
Okay. That's why I just wanted to clarify in going over those numbers.
Yeah, I call it the Clean Heat Carbon Tax. All right, so we're going to do questions on Clean Heat Standard first. Let's do it. Yes, sir.
So it sounds like you bifurcated a few things out of the thermal standard. What about wood, coal, and pellets?
Coal is included in it, but nobody really heats with coal anymore, so I don't bring it up. But coal is considered one of the fuels, and I don't know what the tax. I don't know if anybody's teased out what the tax on coal would be. They do want people to start using advanced wood heat. So the pellets are considered good in the Clean Heat Standard. There is not a penalty for burning cordwood yet, but they certainly want to discourage that. And there's a broader argument that has to do with burning biofuels, like at the McNeil plant in Burlington and the Rygate plant. That is whether or not. What that really comes down is to whether or not they can sell carbon credits because they're considered clean, or they have to buy carbon credits because they're considered dirty. And that's still playing out. And it'll be interesting to see because a lot of the politicians pushing this are from Burlington, and they would certainly much rather have their heat not have to be jacked up in price because they have to buy carbon credits in order to sell power from McNeil. Yes, sir.
Yes, I have a question. The Clean Heat Standard, does it apply to industrial use of propane?
Yeah.
Or will that be, okay. Because the company I work for, my manager gave me this today to ask questions. She couldn't be here. Since January, we've used 95,646 gallons of propane in one of our buildings for one of the dryer processes. That's, at the low side, that's $95,000 extra over the last 8 months, or $191,000 on the high side, which is 20% to 40% of the monthly revenue per month. When I have the breakdown list here, we've already worked with Vermont Efficiency to optimize every system in that building and on our site. How do they expect a business to function?
How do they expect a business to function? I don't know. I mean, this is what was so maddening about the process. You know, I watched a lot of committee testimony, and people from the delivery folks, the people who do the HVAC work, businesses came in, people who really understand the logistics of how these things are going to be, or how they're going to impact our economy. And they just didn't care. They don't listen. The people that they listen to are the special interests from VPIRG, the special interests from the Conservation Law Foundation, the special interests from the Sierra Club. Those are the people that they pay attention to. They really do not. I really think that they believe that anybody who's in the private sector, you know, if you're earning a living in the private sector, they think we're all Scrooge McDuck. And they pass a tax, and we go up into our attic, do a swan dive into the treasure chest full of gold coins, and take out whatever it is they're asking, and it doesn't affect us. But they just don't have that mentality that this is going to affect businesses like the one that you just described in ways that are going to negatively impact. They just don't think that way. And you have to change those brains in the room. Yes, sir.
Even heat pumps use a lot of electricity. So if you could install these things, which of course we can't, what would happen to the electrical utilities?
Well,
has anybody even looked at that?
Yes, Burlington Electric, which is why they lobby for this. They think it's going to be the greatest thing in the world. They're going to sell a lot more electricity as a result. And, you know, that's one of the special interests, again, that they listen to. You should probably have my friend Meredith Anglin come and talk to your group here about the implications for the electric grid, because she's the real expert. They say that the electric grid can handle it, but, you know, a lot of the infrastructure for the electric grid, I don't see that happening. They need to put a lot of the investment into upping the electric grid, and that's sort of separate from the clean heat standard, but there is the renewable energy standard that they also passed, which is going to drive up your electric bills by an estimated $4.5 billion to billion, no, sorry, 400 and something million to $1 billion a year, which is about $192 on your electric bill. But they need to expand and build out the infrastructure for the grid. And not just the grid, but for houses. I mean, a lot of the houses, they want you to have an electric car. They want you to heat and cook and do everything else, heat your water with electric. And people don't have in their homes the electrical panels and the electrical wiring that's necessary to handle all of that electricity coming into the house. So if you have to upgrade from a 100 amp panel to a 400 amp panel, that's costly. And that is not reflected in any of the costs for the clean heat standard. That's one of the things that they say they don't. Yes, ma'am.
Have the hospitals ever weighed in, or other municipalities, or colleges, or schools that have big boilers, you know, kind of shooting off this gentleman's question about private businesses? I mean, hospitals, they must have run on oil and, you know, have a big infrastructure. They have to have a generator, a backup generator, and everything for their patients, operating room.
Yeah,
Have they ever said anything? Have they ever weighed in, do you know?
That's a good question about hospital. The only one, I'm not aware if they have. I haven't seen. I know that UVM is in the UVM Medical Center is in the process of getting a pipe installed from the McNeil plant, and the steam from the McNeil plant is going to come and generate electricity. And the details of that, you need somebody with more expertise than I am. But that's a big part of that McNeil debate. So they would be using non-oil electricity or renewable electricity for the hospital, for UVM Medical Center. What, you know, Copley and Rutland and, you know, all the others, I don't know.
And one other just question on this. I know that Hydro-Quebec in Canada has a lot of, you know, so-called renewable energy that could have been easily transferred down to Vermont, because I read an article on that. Now, how come they didn't even consider that if they're considering all this climate business? I mean, have you heard any discussion on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is getting more away from clean heat and more into
Right.
electricity policy, but during the renewable energy standard deliberations, a year and a half, a little over a year ago, over the summer, they had a working group come together to write the legislation for updating our renewable energy standard. On that group were lobbyists for VPIRT, for the Sierra Club, for Energy Action Vermont, and who was the other one? Four. So there were like 4 legislators, I think, and four lobbyists, and they had some people from the industry. The lobbyists were the one that the legislators were listening to. And these are people who had direct ties from their board members, from their donors, to renewable energy companies, people who build it or invest in renewable energy companies. It was the most corrupt thing I've witnessed in 20 years of observing Vermont policy. Well, maybe not the most corrupt, but certainly in the top 5. I guess the EB5 scandal was up there too. And you know, why isn't nuclear considered a clean energy project? Well, because these donors don't make nuclear. Why isn't Hydro-Quebec considered renewable energy? Because these folks don't want to compete with Hydro-Quebec. They want to force you, the electricity buyer, to buy their stuff. And that's what those lobbyists...
Solar and wind? Solar and wind?
Solar and wind. You know, it's the small scale solar. It's you know, that's what the law is designed to do. And in fact, we had a couple of the utilities people saying, the way you're writing this law, you're forcing us to work with certain people. That's who those people are. And not one of the legislators on that committee raised a hand and said, who are you talking about?
Yeah. Doesn't this mirror what California is doing? Didn't this come from California's policy? GWSD, whatever that.
Yeah, there are a lot of, a handful of states, and California is certainly one that we pay a lot of attention to with clean heat standard and the Clean Cars Initiative for transportation, and they're all somewhat different. The thing that's different about Vermont with the other clean heat stuff, and I touched on this, but this is what makes us very unique, is nobody else is doing this like the cryptocurrency model. Most of them, what they do is, you know, everybody compares this to like the regional greenhouse gas thing, which is you have to buy carbon credits in order to burn electricity. There's a number of reasons why it's not really a good comparison. But the big one is RGGI will issue credits. They print them like a certificate, and they auction them off once a quarter to, it's like a half a dozen or a dozen, 20 very sophisticated electric utilities, and say, okay, this month we're only going to sell 100 credits, and they bid on it, and then it goes away. So they don't have that whole process of how did you install a heat pump, did you reduce greenhouse gases, and then we're going to calculate how many credits you get based on what you took out of the atmosphere. Nobody else anywhere is insane enough to try that. But that's the big difference.
Did they build in any exemptions to the law for their friends?
Not that I'm aware of.
Surprising.
Not that I'm aware of at this point. But you know, the rules are still being written. We'll find out in December or January when they come back. Who has a question that I haven't picked on yet? Yes, sir.
A lot of Democrats would say, then wrong. What is a more feasible solution to lower our emissions? Because I'm sure that's probably a counterpoint you might get.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer that I would give to, you know, how are you going to lower your emissions? I think Vermonters are actually doing a pretty good job of lowering our emissions. We have some of the lowest emissions in the country, and Judy can speak to the numbers probably better than I can, because Matt Coda's talked about over the past like 20 years, how much, I said it's 700 and something gallons of fuel that we burn today. It used to be like, what
1,700. Matt just quoted. He said in the 80s, an average home used 1,700 gallons of heating oil or propane, and now the average home uses 700 gallons.
That's right.
Per year.
Yep. So we've gone from 1,700 gallons to 700 gallons since the 1980s in fossil fuel use, and we've switched a lot to cleaner propane, natural gas, which also reduces our emissions. They don't want to count that. They want to pretend that that's not a good thing.
So you think our emissions are gonna keep going down just by us, like, doing our thing?
Yeah, they're going to go down just because people have an incentive to burn less fuel. It's cheaper. I mean, Judy wants us to buy. Burn more fuel than buy. I'm just kidding you, Judy. But yeah, no, we all have an incentive to lower our bill, and a lot of the ways that we do that through efficiencies and buying cleaner, cheaper fuels is going to lower our emissions. You know, our emissions from the vehicles that we're purchasing are lower. But, you know, we also have to look at what's realistic. And we have a climate policy right now that is totally 100% focused on greenhouse gas reduction. And that's not going to do anything to stop the next flood from occurring. It's not going to do anything to stop warmer temperatures from occurring in the winters and summers, because we're just too small, and we're not convincing the rest of it. We're not convincing Russia, we're not convincing China, we're not convincing India to follow us along these routes. So what we have to do with the limited resources we have, I think, is focused on climate mitigation, which is flood protection, protecting our, or building out the infrastructure in our sewage treatment plants so that when we do get large influxes of water, they don't overflow and put raw sewage into the lakes and rivers. We need to be strengthening our transportation, you know, so expanding the culverts so when we do get floods, the roads don't wash out. In certain cases where we have development in floodplains, we need to start moving that development out of the floodplains to allow the rivers to expand without doing damage to individual private property. That's what I would say to that, answer that question.
Can I go back to your cryptocurrency methodology? Who benefits from that other than the state of Vermont? Power companies, electric companies, but anybody that's carbon credits, they're not just going to be sold in Vermont. They can be sold to anybody. Is that correct?
Again, the rules are being written now, but if I'm recalling testimony from the committees, it's an in-state system. I don't think that we're going to allow people from out of state to buy into it. How that ultimately gets worked out, we're going to see from the rules. But who benefits from this? And again, I said, without wanting to give them any ideas, because it would be a terrible thing for them to do, but if they just expanded the excise tax that we currently have on fuel, 2 cents, and let's say they raised it to $4 a gallon, that requires nothing. That requires no infrastructure. So one of the big reasons that I think that they're doing this is, A, so they can say, well, it's not a tax. We didn't tell the fuel companies to pass the $4 a gallon along to you. That was their decision. They're the bad guys. But it also creates this political class of people who will all of a sudden start working in this sphere. As I said, you know, $40 million a year, all the bureaucrats that it's going to take to hunt down and categorize and track and all that stuff, they become a voting bloc who becomes dependent financially on, that's their job. My job is to go to the House and figure out how many tons of carbon this measure takes out of the atmosphere, and I'm going to assign you a credit level, and then I'm going to hand it off to this other guy who works at the bank, the carbon credit bank, and he's going to oversee that. So, and then you've got this is going to be funneling billions of dollars through Efficiency Vermont, so they're going to expand their employment. You'll have a lot of people that are now on the payroll, and when you have people who are on the payroll doing this sort of thing, they create a political fiefdom that now is a special interest and a voting bloc to make sure that the program perpetuates itself. Yes, ma'am.
So we can look back and see who voted for what.
Yeah.
So is there some way that we can get these, hopefully they'll get voted out, but that's not hope, if they all get voted out. But is there some way that we can keep them accountable? Can we say, okay, you voted for this, when we get sued, we can turn around as a collective government body and sue the legislators that voted it in? Can we do that?
I don't think he'll get very far suing the legislators who voted for this. They have immunity, and some of them didn't vote for it. Right? No, I don't think he'll have success with that. But yeah, the only way to keep them accountable is at the ballot box. And yes, the roll call votes are there. It's honestly, it's very much along party lines. It's not entirely along party lines. I don't think any Republican voted for it. There were maybe 3 Democrats in the House and 3 Democrats in the Senate who voted to support the governor's veto of it. And of those 3 in the Senate, I think 2 of them, well, one of them passed away, one of them's not running for office again. So that's your crib note, but you can go to the legislative website and look specifically to see who voted for it and who voted against it. And there's lots of votes. It's twice there, in 2022 and 2023 there were the votes to override the governor's veto of the bill, which that's sort of my go-to vote. But they also had to vote for it out of their body, out of the House, out of the Senate. There's a vote to agree with the other body's changes so there's several places. Yeah, you voted for it here, you voted for it here, you voted for it here, you voted for it here. And if they voted for it 4 or 5 times over the last couple of years, you can bet they're going to vote for it again when it comes back up in January. All right, I'll take your question, and we're closing in on 7 o'clock, and we're an hour, and you wanted me to talk about property taxes too, so I want to leave some time for that. Sharon?
Our legislator here in Brandon wrote on Front Porch Forum that this Affordable Heat Act was explicitly designed to help Vermonters save money on fuel bills by switching to clean energy heat, and then said that this bill does not raise the price of fuel or put in place a carbon tax. So when I read this, I am not sure how it would help me to switch to electric heat because my electric bill is already high. So I'm having trouble understanding this and either believing it or I don't understand. I hate to think people lie, but how could this bill not raise the price of fuel or put in place a carbon tax? I'm sorry to put you in that position, but I just want to understand. I have this Front Porch Forum post from our representative, and I just want to understand how it is that the bill, which I've read as well, does exactly that, and this says that it doesn't.
Yeah, she's not being honest. She's sort of using weasel words. Is it a carbon tax? I think it's absolutely a carbon tax. They're calling it a carbon credit. Forcing you to buy a carbon credit they're saying it's not a tax. And that's a semantic difference, but it's going to come out of your fuel bill. Now what they're saying is what she's saying is, but it doesn't jack up the price of fuel. Well, it does, and we just got the potential study that says it's going to jack it up by $1.78 to $4.03 a gallon for oil and kerosene, $2.12 for propane. But what she's trying to weasel around is that the fuel dealers have the option of eating that cost and not passing it along to you. So we didn't do it. They're the bad guy. But of course they're going to pass it on to the consumer because they have no choice. They would go bankrupt if they tried to eat $4 per gallon. So it is a carbon tax. And in fact, there's a great video, and I have a YouTube page that's connected, and one of the early videos shows Mark McDonald, who's another senator on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, on the floor of the Senate. This is the year that the governor was successful in vetoing it. He said, of course it's a carbon tax. He said, people in this building don't want to call it a carbon tax because the bill calls it something else. But on the street, it's a carbon tax. And if we're going to be passing a carbon tax on home heating fuel, we ought to be honest about it. And this is a guy who radically supports this bill. He thinks this is a great idea. He thinks he's saving the planet, and he wants full credit for passing a carbon tax on home heating fuel. But he was honest about it. And again, as I said, Dick McCormick, this is a Rube Goldberg carbon tax. That's exactly what it is. So when she says it's not a carbon tax, she's playing a semantic game. It's a carbon tax. When she said it doesn't raise the price of fuel, it absolutely raises the price. It's going to raise the price of fuel a lot.
Because these numbers, $1.73 to $4, are on top of the market value price that we
Yeah, they're
already
on top
pay.
of the market value.
They're on top of the price. So when you get your bill, it's going to be whatever it is today or whatever it is at the market level plus. And the other thing I've heard is that the legislature will make a decision to empower the Public Utility Commission to set this rate, but it won't be until next August. So my fuel dealer is telling me there will be no pre-buys next year because they will not know what to charge us. So I just went and paid for a pre-buy for my 700 gallons for my house for the year, and I will not be able to do that next year. And I'm wondering, the timing seems kind of funny. It seems slightly later than the legislative session, so it's not them. And it seems awfully close to when our heating season is, so you really wouldn't have time to say, oh shucks, I should have put in a heat pump and have it installed. So people are going to get caught. Matt Coda from the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association said within 2 years Vermonters will be in a heating crisis. And he said that the fuel dealers will close. Many of the family-owned fuel dealerships will close because if they don't reduce the amount that they sell you, starting January 2026, they will be hit with a penalty July of 2028. And most of them will be able to avoid it if they close. And so this will create a monopoly, is what Matt Coda said. And we will be looking at Global Oil and Vermont Gas Systems controlling everything. Now, I've seen how that's worked with Blue Cross Blue Shield. It hasn't really worked out well to have a monopoly. So I'm pretty worried.
Well, I think you're exactly right, and I think that that is the intended, unintended consequence of this, is to drive all the small fuel dealers out of business, to create a monopoly that will then become a public-private partnership with the state, essentially.
That's the word I was waiting for. Yes.
Yep, and you're right. That's what they did with health insurance with Blue Cross Blue Shield. That's what they did with health delivery services with UVM Medical Center. That's what they're in the process of doing with childcare, driving out the childcare businesses, the small mom and pops that create these center-based public school-run. And all of those things are crises now.
And they're doing it with carpenters too.
But I do think that that's how they operate. They want to have a monopoly business that they will then partner with, that they feel like they can control, and I do think that's the intended, unintended consequence of this, behind this legislation, unfortunately.
Thank you.
4 small dealers already went out this summer.
Yeah.
One didn't even sell their business, they just turned the keys over.
Oh, so sad.
Unbelievable.
All right. Clean heat standard good? Well, it's not good.
It's not good.
You'll understand. All right. I know that went long. I got 2 minutes now for property tax.
We'll give you more.
Okay. So property taxes. We just got walloped in my town. What happened this year was sort of a perfect storm, but it's not really where to start. We go back to Act 60, and what I call Act 60 plus, which is Act 60, Act 68, Act 153, Act 45. What was the consolidation bill? 46. Act 46. All of those bills, and the patchwork of the statewide property tax to fund education, which is decided by local votes, is really, like the clean heat standard, extremely complicated and difficult for people to understand, and nobody really understands how it works. And if you go to your legislator, and say, I'm mad at you because I just got a property tax bill that's 30% higher than it was last year. They say, well, don't blame us. Blame the local school board for passing the bill. And you go to your local school board and they say, don't blame us, blame the legislature for passing the yield bill. And by the way, you voted for the school budget. So, you know, you only got yourself to blame. So you say, okay, well, I'll vote down the school budget. They say, well, don't do that because, you know, everybody else is voting up their school budget. And if you vote yours down, you're not going to lower your rate. You'll just be paying for everybody else's kids to get a better education. So where do you go? I mean, it's just sort of like this, there's no way to fix the system. And if you're an outsider looking in and saying, is this a fair, common sense approach to how we should fund the education for our children, you'd say, no, this is insane. But if you look at it from the perspective of a special interest group that wants to extract the most amount of money from the taxpayers with the least amount of accountability to anybody so the money will continue to flow, it is a friggin' Swiss watch. And it is working like a charm. And the problem that they ran into this year, we're all sort of like the frogs, you know, in the pot. And they're slowly turning up the heat every year. But this year there was a perfect storm because we had the evaporation of the COVID money and that came in. We had this pupil weighting bill that they passed a couple years ago that was implemented this last year that created this perverse incentive for people to raise their, if you were in a high spending town, to spend above a 5% cap that they had on property tax rates, because anything above that 5% was free money. So hey, let's do it. So everybody did that, and then they had to repeal that, and that created all sorts of chaos. And you had added expenses from high inflation that were impacting the cost of a lot of things. I was going to say insurance, but that's not, who's in charge of insurance? The Green Mountain Care Board. So they say, don't blame us, it's the insurance costs. Well, you know, it's your policy that makes the insurance go up. So you deserve some blame for that. So all those things sort of happened at once, so we got this big bang of a property tax increase. And I think it's good that happened. It's not good. I mean, my property taxes in Stowe went up 28%, so that's not good. But at least there's a silver lining that's got people aware that we have a real problem on our hands. Because we've got, when Act 60 was passed, there were about 106,000 kids in the K-12 system. Today there's less than 80,000. And depending upon how you, because there's like ghost kids, somebody told me it's actually down to about 73,000 kids, depending upon if you count, how you count it. But test scores are going down, and they have been, a lot of people are blaming COVID, but this trend started about a decade and a half ago. So it pre-exists COVID that our test scores are dropping. We used to be like top 5 nationally in terms of test scores, and now I think we're like 17, and it's a downward trend. So we're spending more and more money on fewer and fewer kids, and we're getting worse and worse results. For, you know, and the property tax situation that just happened is, it's unsustainable. Now, what happened with the yield bill that they passed this year? That they knew, the current legislators knew in December of last year that we were looking at like an 18% property tax increase. Craig Bolio, the tax commissioner, warned the legislature, be careful. They didn't do anything about it. They're like, you're just fear-mongering. It's not going to be 18%. It's never 18%. So they didn't really do anything in the legislature for months, the first couple months of the session. Then it came back, it was actually going to be over 20%. Then they kind of sprung into action, and for about 48 hours, there was actually a real serious conversation about education finance reform in the Ways and Means Committee in the House, which is the Committee of Jurisdiction. Scott Beck, who is a representative from St. Johnsbury on that committee, is now a candidate for Senate in Caledonia County, had a plan that he's been working on for years, and he threw that on the table, and it started rubbing their chins and squinting their eyes at it, and I thought, okay, maybe they're actually going to get something. Teachers Union came in, Superintendent's Association came in, Principals Association came in. No way are you doing this. You are not going to cut off the supply of money. And that was it. It was done. They kicked the can down the road a couple of years. They're supposed to come out with some preliminary recommendations in December. I haven't been watching these as closely as I've been watching the Clean Heat Standard deliberations, but they created this panel as part of the yield bill, Act 179. And who is this panel made up of? The Teachers Union, the Superintendent's Union, the Principals Association, the bureaucrats, the Administrators Union, I forget exactly what it's called. So all the special interests that have every incentive not to change the system and who have at every point in the past 10 years stopped any real meaningful reform from taking place. So this group is not going to put forward any sort of real meaningful property tax reform. But we really do need to have it. And I will just say that, I'll throw in my 2 cents about what they should be looking at. There are 47 states that have some form of property tax safeguard for individual homeowners, so that what happened to a lot of people in the state can't happen to them. There's either a cap on the percentage increase that your property taxes can take on year over year. There is a cap on how your property is appraised, so you can't get like a doubling of the price of your property, so that it gets reflected in there. And there's one other category, I forget exactly how it works, but 47 states have this. 3 don't. One of them is New Hampshire, and New Hampshire, that's because they don't have an income tax and they don't have a sales tax, and they rely almost 100% for their state revenue on the property tax, so they have to do that. The other is Tennessee, which doesn't really seem to need any particular safeguards because they have some of the lowest property taxes in the country. And the third one that doesn't have any safeguards is us. And unlike New Hampshire, we have a sales tax and we have an income tax, in case you haven't noticed. So what I would recommend that the legislature do is look at those other 47 states, see what they do. What is their concoction? The most famous one is Proposition 13 in California, which says that your property taxes can't increase by more than, I think it's 1% a year. And there are loopholes in that, so they can raise revenue, but that's California. That's blue California, and they can't really repeal that. So we need to have something in place like that, so an individual homeowner will never experience a 30-35% property tax increase in 1 year. So that's simpler to explain than the Clean Heat Standard. So I'll open it up for questions there. Yes, sir.
Yes, first I want to applaud that you're saying it's non-sustainable, because it is not. I would like to characterize what I'm saying is that I did spend 6 years on the school board years ago. And our per pupil cost was $5,000 per pupil, which I thought at that time was crazy. And we're now around $15,000 per student.
25.
Or 25. So it's insane. The movement that has to be made, to my logic, and I also am a selectman here in town, and we get all the flack when we send out property bills because the school tax is on our thing, and everybody, we're the low-hanging fruit, so everyone comes and screams at your select board. And there's a couple people in the room that worked very hard with me in the last 2 years on budget, so I know they know this. However, in 1985, I was on a study of school plan under Madeline Cuny. We worked with 15 other states to try to look at how to prevent kids from dropping out of school, et cetera, and how to take care of the kids that aren't going on to college. Vermont was laughed at by the states like California, because the states like California had one district would be bigger than our entire state. When we say we're top heavy, everyone thinks we mean we're top heavy, that we have too many teachers. We don't have too many teachers. We have too many districts with superintendents. We don't need one superintendent for every high school in the state. And that's what we have now. You have one superintendent here, one in Woodstock, one in Castleton, one in Rutland. You have a curriculum person at each place making over $120,000 a year that is totally controlled by the state, telling them what they have to do. I can guarantee the curriculum at Otter Valley is no different than the curriculum in Castleton. Yet we have all of those positions. The change has to come from Montpelier. It's not sustainable the way it is. And that's where it's got to start. And then I also believe that school tax should come from property tax. Because as you're saying now about the carbon tax indirectly coming on, seniors who live in homes that are on fixed incomes can hardly take these kind of increases on their property tax bills without having to sell their homes. And I know many of them, like my own in-laws who are 92 and 93 and just want to hang on long enough to pass away in the home they've lived in for so many years. And they can't, the system the way it is. So I love that you said it's not sustainable, and I hope people will get as wired up about schools and the system of our schools in Vermont as we are about carbon tax. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that sums it up very, very well. And I do think that you're correct. It has to come from Montpelier. I'll just mention a story that I recently read in an op-ed, and I think it was Vermont Digger, by Ann Manwaring, who's a former representative from Wilmington, and she was on the Appropriations Committee years ago. Probably she's been gone for probably 8 years. But she said that she was on a group that looked into how many pieces of legislation impacted the cost of education. He said over a course of 5 years, there was 130 pieces of legislation that Montpelier passed that impacted the cost of delivering education. And some of them were little costs, like we mandated what kind of cleaning fluids that they had to use in the class and clean the buildings. And some of them were big, like pre-K. But that's a lot. I mean, we talk about preserving local control. And when you have Montpelier passing 130 laws in 5 years, telling you how to micromanage the cleaning fluid that you use in the schools, how much local control really exists?
None.
What are we trying to protect? But that's always, what the special interests will say. Oh, well, you can't have Montpelier take responsibility for lowering costs because then you'd be losing local control. You don't have local control. They have the control, but what they're trying to do is foist responsibility for the costs off on the people who are not responsible for it. And that's the system. That's how we have to long-term change the system. I agree with you. Yes, Sharon?
Many moons ago, I was a school district business manager for 12 years, and I can tell you that we had about 1 to 10, 1 to 6, 1 to 8. One law would change town management, and there'd be 6 to 8 to 10 that would change school management, and we would have to hire new administrators to do these extra reports, to come up with new programs, to follow these rules that came out of the legislature. And we used to say, oh, why us? Why? Now, so my question is, I can do basic math. I'm an accountant. And so if my house used to be worth $100,000 and I was taxed on $100,000, and now my house is worth $200,000 because the market has gone up, technically my tax rate should cut in half in order to raise the same amount of money. So maybe it should be in half plus 5 or 6%, 8% for inflation. So I don't understand why our taxes didn't go down when all of our houses are worth twice as much over the last few years, the market gains. And I cannot figure out how they came up with 20% increases when we should have seen a reduction when our properties doubled in market value. So I don't know where they went with all that money, but remember when it started with $1.10, and that's long forgotten, that rate. But the math doesn't work for what they're telling us. And somehow, according to Representative Butch Shaw from Pittsburgh, there was going to be about a 20% tax increase. The legislature found about 96 million to buy that down, so it was 13.8% on average. In Brandon, we were 16.67% residential and a little over 12% non-residential increase. What Butch said to us at a Rutland meeting I was at a few months ago was that we may be looking at another 20% in the next year, because they won't have that 96 million to buy it down if there's not surplus in the budget somewhere, or some influx of revenue. So I don't know if anybody else knows how their math works this way. How come my house is worth more and I'm getting taxed so much more? What are they doing with all the money? Is there like money trucks up there? Does anybody know where the money trucks are? Are they backing up with dump trucks
They have
and
2 more
schools
years of tax
with gold?
increases.
Oh, yeah.
This, the teacher, somebody announced it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I'm not going to try to explain how the yield bill works, or the yield formula works, because I would screw it up. We don't have time. But a good point that you wanted to make is they, in quote, bought down the property tax rate from where it was going to be around 20% to where it landed around 13.8%. Buying down means they just took the money out of a different pocket. And what they did was they raised a $20 million tax on internet services, things like TurboTax, ironically. You have to pay a tax to pay your taxes now. And they added a...
That's almost, we need tissue. They shouldn't be laughing.
Short-term mortgage.
And they added a 3% surcharge to short-term rentals, which I think is another cruel irony, because a lot of people have to resort to renting out a room short-term for Airbnb in order to pay their property taxes. So now you've got to pay
and a 20% DMV fee.
That didn't go to the, that was not for the education fund. And they did have some surplus money that showed up in the general fund that they used to buy it down further. I forget exactly how much that was. But when they say that they lowered your property taxes, they did, but they just, some of it came out of other pockets. So what we really have is a spending problem. And saying that we don't have too many teachers, we have a student to staff ratio of about 4.4 staff for every student in the state, which is far and away the lowest in the world. We have a 10.5 to 1 student teacher ratio, which is also the lowest in the nation by a lot. I think the next one that comes up is like 12 point something. And the average is 15 students. 16, Terry? Yep. Education Committee, Senator Terry Williams, thank you. So 16 to 1. So we still have a lot of staff. And I agree, the supervisory union level is where the cutting needs to begin. We do not need 54 supervisory unions in the state with 73,000 students in it. Were you stretching? Waving away a fly. Yes, sir.
Oh, yeah, I want to chuck out one more piece of information, and I may end up being criticized for it, I hope not. I just want to remind people that the one thing that Vermont does have that does help on your school tax rate is the Vermont rebate program for households with income of less than, I believe it's $128,000. And it protects against the school part of your tax bill going up. And any household that has under that can apply for the rebate. It's fantastic for low-income people and for retired people. And the reason I say I hope not to not get criticized by it is one of our selectmen mentioned it at one of our budget meetings, and he was severely criticized that he was separating out the population by diversity. The only information I know is that our town clerk, who's the only one who sees that information with tax bills, has mentioned to us that she knows that probably 50% of the people in Brandon who qualify for that are not taking advantage of that. And they really should. It's just something that will help keep people in their homes. So,
no criticism. Do what you got to do.
Well, not yet.
But I will say, I'm a tax preparer, and that the credits coming through are reducing each year. They're coming in lower, and so they're whittling away at that. I don't think that's going to be a long-term way
it's not.
to
The
stay
long-term
on.
answer is they need to get expenses under control, and they gotta start at the top.
All right,
Thank you.
I think that's going to be it. I just do want to say that Judy Taranovich has some postcards that she is asking people to sign that will go to legislators about the clean heat standard. If you haven't signed one already, catch up with Judy. She's right here in the front row before you leave tonight. And thank you all for coming out. And